The pitcher sat full, yet no one dared pour. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your messages always make my day. Hearing from you makes each mystery worth sharing. Let's begin. If you've ever watched a man weigh the moral calculus of rising from a comfortable chair to answer the doorbell, you haven't met Nero Wolfe. Wolfe delegates anything that can be delegated without violating the penal code. On that particular noon, Wednesday, late enough in September that Fritz had an eye on mushrooms and an attitude about the weather, the bell rang during coffee, and Fritz's shoes whispered on the hall runner before Wolfe's right eyebrow finished its climb. Wolfe lowered his cup like a judge putting down a gavel and gave me the practiced side glance that means, if the universe is at my door, send it away and bill me for the stamp. Relax, I told him. It's probably the universe's secretary. I went to the front, swinging the door no wider than polite. A woman stood there with the kind of composure you rent by the hour at an art museum opening. She was slim without broadcasting it, in a dove-gray jacket and a hat that made her eyes more blue than God intended, if you like inventory. In her hands, in a brown paper wrapper that had been folded with too much attention, was an object shaped like a pitcher and carried like a newborn. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, not asking. "I'm Portia Vale. I have an appointment by default, or an emergency by another name." "That's 2 names too many," I said. "Come in before the hat wilts." In the office, Wolfe had reinflated the dignity I had deflated by opening the door. He didn't rise, but he made room on the red leather chair in front of his desk with a nod that would have cleared a railroad yard. I took the paper package and set it on my desk, in reaching distance for me and out of it for him. His preference in all things tangible. "I'm aware that Mr. Wolfe doesn't take on kitchen squabbles," she said, while removing her gloves 1 finger at a time. "But this is not a squabble. It's sabotage, and it threatens reputations I care about, including, I suspect, one Mr. Wolfe may care about privately." Wolfe glanced at me, then at the orchids through the glass doors. "You could have hung laundry on the silence he let stretch." "State it," he said. "We staged a benefit supper last night at Rusterman's for the Metropolitan Gastronomy Trust," she said. That landed like a quarter on a drumhead. Rusterman's, if you haven't been within sniffing distance of a decent sauce lately, is the restaurant that Wolfe owns a piece of and pretends is simply a fact of nature. The menu was built around a revived service, a warm claret poured from an 18th century silver jug to accompany the final course, a savory custard, all very ceremonial. Photographers, a critic, 6 board members who treat. Admission like a coronation. She touched the wrapped bundle like a priest palpating a relic. When time came, the sommelier tipped the pitcher. Nothing. Not a drop. He tried again. It wouldn't pour. We were humiliated. The critic laughed, the board looked stricken, and a donor who likes to dramatize leaned back and said we'd planned a stunt and botched it. "Pfui," Wolfe said very mildly. It was not encouragement. It was classification. "The thing is," she went on, "the jug was full. We weighed it later in the office. Someone had made sure it appeared empty when it mattered. That's not a trick you play on a theater. It's a trick you play on a name." "And you are?" Wolfe asked without inflection. "Director of the trust." She gave me a fast smile as if that might grease the gears. "We fund culinary archives and sponsor apprenticeships. We borrowed the jug from a private collection for the night. I procured it, I signed for it, and I stood in front of the press when nothing came out of it but ridicule. I had the paper off the bundle by then. The jug, calling it a pitcher would insult its vanity, was silver and proud of it. A pear-shaped belly, a swan neck spout, a hinged lid with a knob that had never been modest. Filigree around the handle that looked like it had been carved to please a duke. If you set it on a sideboard, it wouldn't hold merely claret. It would hold the room's attention. "I had it cleaned and inspected before the event," she said. The sommelier practiced the motion. We set the temperature. It behaved. Then at 9:15 before your friend the critic and 30 benefactors. It defied physics. After everyone left, we weighed it. Heft doesn't lie. Full. But while we were on stage, it might as well have been welded shut. Not welded, Wolfe said. If it weighed full. I'm aware, she said crisply, which is why I'm here. If someone made it not poor, that someone was one of ours. The trust has enemies, but the timing, the staging, only a participant could manage it. I have a board meeting Friday at 4. If I don't clear this, I'll have resignations. Mine among them, and Rusterman's will have a smear from here to Sunday. Wolfe's lids were half down. If you've ever watched the tide come in, you know the look. You mentioned reputations. Enumerate the vulnerable ones, he said. Rusterman's, mine, the Trust's brand, and a gentleman named Hadrian Updike who loaned us the jug from his collection. He's already insinuated we mishandled it. He has a lawsuit in his voice, even when he's ordering coffee. You brought the vessel, Wolfe said, flicking a finger at the silver. May I assume you brought no claret? We left the residue at the restaurant for analysis, she said. Which, if you know restaurants, means someone had a sip and a story by breakfast. Archie, Wolfe murmured. Yeah, I said. I was at my desk when you started ignoring lunch. I can call Rusterman's and ask them to save anything that isn't bolted. That won't be necessary yet. Wolfe's eyes had moved from the jug to Portia Vale's face and back again. Ms. He let that pass with the mercy of a pope. Miss Vale, tell me why you came to me and not the police. Because the only crime here is humiliation, and they don't take that seriously until it's accompanied by a corpse, she said. Because I need the person who did this named, not jailed, and I need it done in a room where people in expensive clothing learn how stupid they are without realizing they're being taught. And because Rusterman's is involved. I assumed Mr. Wolfe would not like his name dragged unless he was pulling the rope. If you think flattery had traction, you haven't met the stubbornest man in Manhattan. Wolfe closed his eyes as if he were smelling time. You assume too much? Your enemies? He asked. That's not a small question, she said, and she didn't smile. We fund programs that don't get a lot of applause, preserving handwritten recipes, underwriting quiet apprenticeships, restoring a chef's library. We displeased 3 people last quarter by saying no. We disappointed 5 by saying maybe, but there's more immediate friction. She paused, and that told me she had rehearsed this part and didn't like it. We've been courting Rusterman's for a partnership to host our events quarterly. That displaces some other restaurants. Also, our board is not harmonious. 4 members had reasons to resent last night's centerpiece. Names, Wolfe said. I can give you 4 now, she said. But I came here for discretion. I'll give them to Mr. Goodwin. Her eyes slid to me and then back to Wolfe. And I'll tell you something else you'll want, which is that I didn't come to you through channels. I came through Fritz Brenner. That did it. You say Fritz in this office, and 2 things happen. Wolfe remembers he is human, and I remember to sit up straighter. Fritz keeps the kitchen at a standard that makes Sunday dinner a religious ritual. If he had put his name to this, it wasn't a trifle. In what capacity? Wolfe asked, a shade less glacial. He's on our culinary preservation committee, she said. Quietly. He knew about the jug because he suggested we feature it. He also told me, without telling me, to see you if anything untoward occurred, and something very toward occurred. Wolfe's mouth softened as if a lemon drop had lowered itself in. Fritz, he said, and it meant several things, one of which was a question to himself. I was looking at the jug, and not because I like silver. The spout had a grace to it that made a promise the body couldn't keep last night anyway. I reached for a paperclip and tested the hinge, the lip, the slot where a strainer might live. Nothing rattled. You say it poured when tested before service, I said. Then didn't. Then did. On the scale. Sounds like it learned shame from the audience. It poured in the office afterward, she said. Onto the floor because the sommelier was angry and my hands were shaking. It poured like a fire hose. I offered, which is the syllable you use when you want the client to think you already have the answer but are too modest to show off. Wolfe wasn't borrowing my modesty. Miss Vale, he said, first, I require a fee. You will write a check in the amount of $30,000, payable to Nero Wolfe. Second, you will agree in writing that any disclosure I make in this matter to parties you identify shall be deemed authorized by you. Third, you will not speak of your visit here to any person not already aware of it except at my instruction. Fourth, you will leave the jug. It wasn't a quick set of conditions, but it wasn't the kind of bargaining where one person pretends to be surprised by the other's price. She had a pen in her bag that looked capable of writing something binding on a head of state. She didn't blink at the number. She didn't blink at anything. Agreed, she said. You'll tell me why you care. No, Wolfe said, which is Nero for end of file. But I knew. If you've ever watched him when Rustermans comes up in conversation, you've seen an eyelid flicker that could be called sentiment if it wasn't so ornery. The restaurant had been Marco Vukcic's and then partly Wolfe's by will and wariness. He might let his name be dragged through tar and feathers by a judge, but not by a failed source. Archie, Wolfe said. Present, I said. You will go to Rustermans. Speak to the manager on duty last night, to the sommelier, to anyone in the kitchen who handled this vessel, or recounts that he did. Obtain the critic's name and the donor who performed at being affronted. Recover any residue from the claret if it exists. Do not let anyone pour anything into or out of that jug until I say so. You will also obtain from Miss Vale a list of the 4 board members she alludes to, and any correspondence in the last month in which they oppose or endorse last night's arrangements. That all? I asked. Or shall I drop by the Mint and pick up a bar of gold for the mantle? Wolfe's eyes closed. You will return by 3. Miss Vale stood. You'll have your list and the correspondence in an hour, she said. Mr. Goodwin, the board members are not shy. They stage their grudges with curtains open. She handed me a folded sheet from her bag with a neat hand, names, numbers, and the addresses of offices that look the way money sounds when it clears. She added one more line and underlined it. Hadrian Updike, and put in a private cell number, the ink darkening with pressure. Updike will call himself a trustee of civilization, she said. He will not consider himself a suspect. He will consider himself a standard. Everyone considers himself a standard, I said, until something weighs more than it should. I nodded toward the jug. When she'd gone, leaving a faint suggestion of citrus and resolve, Wolfe leaned forward the bonus half-inch he gives to objects of interest and studied the spout without touching it. He doesn't touch unless he has to. Contact is for other people. Archie. His tone had a little gravel in it. The jug is honest, but last night it was made dishonest temporarily. Why? To embarrass the trust at Rustermans, to make the critic write a dance on their grave, to make Updike reclaim his toy. Motivation, he said, is a clumsy tool early. The jug's behavior is physical. He opened his eyes. Attend to the people, I will attend to the physics. Sure, I said. You take gravity, I'll take human nature. I hear gravity is easier. He didn't dignify that, but he did one thing that told me the case had crossed his personal bridge from annoyance to appetite. He called, not loudly. Fritz! Fritz appeared in the doorway, fast for him. Wolfe tipped his head toward the jug. You recommended this service to Miss Vale. I did, Fritz said, unhappy about it in the way only a man who respects history can be unhappy about an insult to it. The jug is a beauty, Mr. Wolfe. I saw it when it arrived. It poured beautifully. Wolfe's eyes went up to the orchids, down to the jug, and finally to me. Go, he said. Bring me people and their pretenses. I will, if I must, endure the company of a physicist." "I know just the guy," I said, pocketing Miss Vale's note. "He thinks in equations and eats with a spoon. If the jug obeyed laws it shouldn't, he'll tell us which law it bribed." As I headed out, Wolfe added in a voice that could have pressed flowers, "And Archie, be civil at Rustum Ends." "That's a lot to ask all at once," I told him. "I'll do my best. If anyone refuses to be poured, I'll weigh them." The doorman at Rustum Ends had the look of a man who knew both the value and fragility of good gossip. I gave him the Goodwin grin, my standard issue for reconnaissance, and told him I was there to speak with Mr. Ballinger, the manager. He looked like he wanted to argue, but decided against it, maybe because I was smiling, maybe because he'd heard of the man upstairs who didn't smile at all. Ballinger was in his office, a square of order and anxiety in equal portions. A schedule hung on the wall like a declaration of war against chance. He greeted me like a man expecting a health inspector. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, before I could flash credentials. "Miss Vale said you'd come. I hoped she was joking." "She rarely jokes," I said. "And when she does, she bills for it." I took a seat and pulled out my notebook. "Let's talk about the pitcher that wouldn't pour." His mouth flattened. "A catastrophe, and not of our making. I have 3 board members calling to insinuate incompetence, 1 critic suggesting sabotage, and a Mr. Updike threatening to repossess his heirloom in the courts of Olympus. We cleaned that jug like a chalice. Nothing was wrong with it. You were here the whole evening. From setup to humiliation, I even lifted the jug before service. It was fine. The sommelier?" "Henri," he said, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. "He's a perfectionist with a temper. He claims he tested it not 10 minutes before the pour, said it was obedient, his word. Then, at showtime, nothing. Where's Henri now? Polishing his reputation in the wine cellar, or what's left of it. I found him downstairs among the bottles, looking like a tragic statue in a vineyard. Henri was thin, dramatic, and smelled faintly of Bordeaux and despair. I tell you, it was sorcery, he said, holding a bottle like a prop for his misery. I warmed it properly, I checked the angle, I even practiced the motion, then, pfft, silence. The wine stayed put, as if the jug had grown modest. You poured it afterward, though. Yes, like it had decided the joke was over. I would think myself mad if 30 people had not seen it happen. I let him wind down, then asked the question Wolfe would have if he'd been capable of lowering himself into a cellar. Who handled it after you last tested it and before you brought it to the table? Henri frowned. Portia Vale, briefly. She wanted to see the presentation. Then one of the servers carried it to the sideboard to wait until dessert. No one else touched it that I saw, but there was a delay. The critic, Hadrian Updike, and Miss Vale were having words about the provenance of the jug. I recall that. Words of what flavor? Vinegar, he said. Mr. Updike accused her of failing to mention the insurance coverage. She told him to enjoy his soup. Then they smiled for the photographers. I left him polishing glass and gilt and made my way through the kitchen. A line cook remembered that the jug had sat on a tray by the service door, wrapped in a napkin to keep it from cooling. Nobody touched it, he swore, except maybe one of those trust people wandering back here like they owned the joint. That led me back upstairs to Ballinger. Who else had access? I asked. He rubbed his forehead. Aside from the trust board? 5 of them. Vale, Updike, Marjorie Kent, the socialite, Dr. Ames, and a restaurateur named Pietro Lang. They all hovered. None of them could have tampered with it in plain sight, but I've seen stranger things vanish in this house. Before I left, I checked the residue. A half bottle sat corked in the cooler, labeled, "For evidence, do not serve." Henri had kept it out of loyalty or superstition. I took it. By 3 o'clock, I was back at the brownstone. Wolfe hadn't moved. The jug sat where I'd left it, gleaming and smug. Fritz had gone quiet in the kitchen, which usually means either guilt or inspiration. "Well," Wolfe said, "Rusterman's runs tighter than a banker's conscience. The jug was fine until it wasn't. Henri swears it defied him, and everyone swears they didn't touch it. There was a spat between Miss Vale and Updike about insurance, and 5 board members had wandering privileges. Here's your sample." I set the bottle on his desk. He didn't touch it. He inhaled, faintly, as if catching the ghost of claret. "The liquid is irrelevant for now. The event was engineered to humiliate, not to poison. Did you note the temperament of Miss Vale? Determined, worried, and about as sentimental as a cash register. Good. Then she'll survive the truth. Archie, you will visit Mr. Updike next. He is our fulcrum, and bring back whatever you can about those 4 board members. Their habits, their jealousies, their hobbies, especially anything involving mechanics." Mechanics? Yes. The jug failed not by chance, but by clever interference. The question is how clever, and whether the mind behind it enjoys art, revenge, or merely control. He turned his head slightly toward the kitchen door. "Fritz, have you the schematics of that vessel?" Fritz entered with a small folded diagram, probably sketched from memory. Wolfe's fingers opened it carefully. "Excellent," he murmured. "Now, Archie, go. I will reconstruct its betrayal. Humanity, as usual, will supply the motive." That was Wolfe, sitting still, yet somehow moving faster than anyone else in New York. I pocketed my notebook and the diagram copy, knowing my next stop would be an apartment uptown where a collector named Hadrian Updike probably thought silver couldn't lie. I intended to ask him how it learned. Hadrian Updike lived the way certain people collect reputations, meticulously, at other people's expense. His apartment was a 4th-floor sweep of glass and polish overlooking the park, where every object had a pedigree longer than most bloodlines. The maid who opened the door appraised me like a questionable vintage. She took my name as if spelling it might soil the air, and returned 2 minutes later to say Mr. Updike would grant me 15 minutes. I decided to take that as a compliment. He met me in a study decorated in dark walnut and self-importance. Updike was 60, tall, and cultivated the kind of poise that makes you wonder how often he practices it in mirrors. His mustache was precise enough to measure temperature changes. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand that had never known a callous. Miss Vale mentioned that Nero Wolfe had inserted himself into this affair. I confess, I was surprised. Mr. Wolfe has never taken kindly to theatrics. "You're mistaken," I said. "He loves them. He just prefers to write the script." Took the chair he indicated. "I'm here because your antique picture pulled a disappearing act with its contents. You were present when that happened." He smiled, thin and cold. "Yes, a farce of the first order. A century-old vessel made to look foolish before people who wouldn't recognize craftsmanship if it poured itself over them. Miss Vale should have known better than to parade something she didn't understand." "Maybe she did understand it," I said. "Maybe someone else didn't." He steepled his fingers. "Are you implying sabotage? At Rusterman's? Ludicrous. The jug was in perfect condition when I loaned it. I examined it yesterday morning in my own hands. It has been in my collection for 20 years. Any visitors who might have admired it lately?" He frowned. "Admiration isn't the same as access. But yes, I host a private tasting every second Monday. Collectors, patrons, a few from the trust. Dr. Ames was here last week. So was Pietro Lang. Neither would have reason to tamper with it. They value their reputations." "That makes 2 of you." He ignored that and crossed to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal a lineup of silver that could blind a man on a sunny day. "The picture you're concerned about was made in 1784 by the silversmith Anthony Wakeman. A masterpiece of both balance and function. The mechanism is simple. Pouring relies on a concealed air channel in the handle. If that channel is blocked, even slightly, the vacuum prevents flow. It's elementary physics. Blocked how? Dust, wax, even a thin film of oil, but it would have to be deliberate to last only an hour and then clear itself. I scribbled a note. So, someone could have sealed it temporarily. Conceivably, he said, watching me with the patience of a cobra. But why? To make me look foolish? Or Miss Vale? I can assure you she's more than capable of doing that herself without assistance. He turned back toward the window, the city making a framed halo around his silhouette. The trust has been floundering. Portia Vale is a capable administrator but lacks taste. She wants modernity, culinary programs for the unwashed. I want preservation. It's a philosophical difference, not a crime. I'll make sure Wolfe adds that to his sermon notes. Updike's mouth twitched. Tell Mr. Wolfe I respect him. He understands that standards matter. If the trust had listened to me, this embarrassment would never have occurred. When I left, he escorted me to the door with the air of a man showing a guest out of a courtroom he'd already won. I took the elevator down, making a note to tell Wolfe that Updike's pride could be measured in atmospheres, and maybe that was why the jug didn't pour. It suffocated in self-regard. Back at the brownstone by early evening, Wolfe was still rooted behind his desk, fingers tented under his chin, staring at the picture like it had whispered a confession. Fritz had brought in a plate of veal kidneys that hadn't been touched, which meant Wolfe's thoughts were being stirred, not his appetite. Updike's innocent or too arrogant to fake humility, I reported. He says the jug uses an air channel that could have been blocked, wax, oil, whatever, and that it would need intent to do it, and then unseal itself later. He also hinted that Vale's ideas offend the gods of tradition. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. That explains the method, not the mind. To induce failure precisely when the eyes of the world were upon it, and to reverse the failure moments later. Someone desired public ridicule, not permanent damage. Who benefits? Vale loses. Updike gains ground for his old school brigade. Or maybe one of the others thought making her look foolish would open the chair at the top. He nodded slightly, the motion as precise as Updike's mustache. Dr. Ames is a chemist by training. Pietro Lang, a restaurateur, who has quarreled with Rustamans over clientele. And Marjorie Kent, the socialite, ambitious, acquisitive, impatient with obscurity. I will see them, but not yet. He glanced at the jug again. The means interests me most. A temporary seal requires planning, precision, and access. Perhaps also chemistry. Meaning Ames. Meaning that we will not guess. You will invite Miss Vale here tomorrow morning. She shall bring the 4 board members, each in turn, not together. I will observe their manners and their mendacity. The jug will be present. He leaned back and reached for his beer, the first sip of the day. Someone tampered with this vessel not to conceal truth, but to display it, mockingly. A jest of intellect, Archie and I despise jests that presume intelligence. Then you'll love this case, I said. It's got your favorite ingredients, ego, humiliation, and physics. Wolfe shut his eyes briefly. Pfui! Bring me the people, and humanity will again prove more porous than silver. Morning arrived, wrapped in drizzle and the smell of Fritz's patience evaporating with the coffee. Wolfe was already in his chair, freshly shaven and looking like a man resigned to suffer fools, profitably. The pitcher gleamed on his desk as if proud of the attention. He'd positioned it just so, half-turned toward the red leather chair that would soon hold the next suspect. It was going to be an audition, not an interview, and Wolfe was the kind of director who didn't tolerate improvisation. At 9 sharp, the doorbell rang. Fritz announced Portia Vale, followed by her first volunteer, Marjorie Kent. Miss Kent was tall, tan, and wore money as if it were a personality trait. She had the practiced grace of someone used to winning arguments by exhausting the room. I showed her in and took my post near the globe stand, notebook open, face politely unreadable. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He barely blinked. "Miss Kent," he said, as if testing the balance of the name on his tongue. "You serve on the Trust's board?" "I do," she said, "and I'm here because Portia insisted. I think this entire business is nonsense, but apparently it's damaging our reputation, so here I am." Wolfe's eyes stayed half-closed. "You were present at Rusterman's when the demonstration failed?" "Yes. Front row, so I had a perfect view of the disaster." "Describe what you saw." She sighed like an actress being forced to repeat her best line for amateurs. Henri brought the pitcher. Miss Vale said a few words. He lifted it. Nothing came out. He tried again, a little harder, and by then people were tittering. Updike was smirking. Portia froze. I don't blame her. It was ghastly. "You examined the picture afterward?" "No, I wanted nothing to do with it. I told Portia to end the event before the critics invented a headline. She refused." Wolfe studied her face a moment longer than was comfortable. "You disapprove of Miss Vale's leadership?" She smiled thinly. "She's efficient, but not imaginative. This trust needs glamour, not bookkeeping." I caught Wolfe's glance. That was enough. "Thank you, Miss Kent," he said. "That will suffice for now. Archie will show you out." When she was gone, he exhaled. "A vain woman, incurious, but not malicious," he muttered. Next. The next was Dr. Lionel Ames, the chemist. He was compact, precise, and slightly flustered, the kind of man who looks as though his pockets are full of important formulas. Vale sat beside him this time, silent but alert. "I'm told," Wolfe began, "that you were among the last to view the jug before its performance." Ames adjusted his glasses. "Indeed. I examined it briefly in the lounge. I collect silver, though not of that period. I was curious about its air channel. Remarkably clever design. Perfectly functional." "Did you handle it?" "Only momentarily, to test its balance. Miss Vale was there." "Did you notice anything unusual about its spout or handle?" "Nothing visible. But if you suspect tampering—" He hesitated, peering at the jug on Wolfe's desk. "I would guess someone blocked the air passage with a wax compound. A common trick. Heat or alcohol would later dissolve it." "That's speculation," Wolfe said. "Yes," Ames admitted. "But a professional guess. Whoever did it knew the mechanism." "Would you have the means to do it?" "Certainly," he said, almost proud. "But not the motive. I invested a good deal of my time in last night's event. I wouldn't sabotage it." Wolfe's nostrils flared. "Motive is more fluid than claret, Doctor. That will do." After he left, Vale turned to Wolfe. "You think he's guilty?" "I think," Wolfe said, "he's incapable of lying neatly. If he did it, it was for principle, not pettiness." Next. Pietro Lang arrived wearing charm like a borrowed tie. Restaurateur, mid-40s, perpetually tan, and with a handshake designed to imply generosity. He laughed as he took the seat. "Ah, Mr. Wolfe, I've admired your palate from afar. A tragedy what happened at Rusterman's. Those things never happen at my place." "Indeed," Wolfe said dryly. "You have an interest in the trust?" "A partnership proposal," Lang said. Vale turned it down. Rusterman's got the nod instead. I was disappointed, naturally." "Disappointed enough to interfere?" Lang's eyes flashed, but he smiled again. "Come now, I'm a competitor, not a vandal. But if Rusterman's took a bruise last night, I can't say I'm mourning." Wolfe leaned back. "Did you touch the vessel?" "Of course not. I only admired it from the table. Beautiful craftsmanship, though I might have suggested a different decanting ritual. Less theatrical, more tasteful." When he was gone, the silence stretched. Wolfe's brow lowered, and that meant something had clicked behind the curtain. "Archie," he said finally. "Lang's vanity matches Kent's, but his opportunity was greater. yet both lack the delicacy required. The hand that sealed that channel was not clumsy. It belonged to a mind that loves precision and enjoys irony. Meaning Ames. He shook his head slightly. Meaning we are close. Too close for comfort. Tomorrow I will have them all here together. Let them watch the jug pour or not pour on command. And if it refuses again, then I shall know who spoke to it last, he said, and who taught it silence. The next day broke clear, as if the city had been rinsed overnight. By 10 o'clock, the brownstone had the feel of a theatre before curtain, air thick with anticipation and irritation. Wolfe had ordered the office rearranged for the demonstration. The silver jug sat center stage on his desk, gleaming under a shaft of morning light. Fritz hovered in the background with the kind of focus usually reserved for soufflés. I was stationed by the wall with my notebook, pretending it was a prop instead of a weapon. Wolfe had been uncommunicative through breakfast, which usually meant the mental gears were spinning with enough friction to light a fire. When Portia Vale arrived, her composure was tight as a violin string. She wore dark blue this time, somber, unyielding. "They're on their way," she said, setting down her bag like a declaration of war. "You're sure this is necessary?" "Utterly," Wolfe said. "Public deceit requires public exposure. You plan to accuse them all together?" "I plan to observe them together," he corrected. "Accusations are untidy until confirmed." By 10:30, they had gathered, Marjorie Kent radiant and impatient, Dr. Ames wound up like a metronome, Pietro Lang radiating charm in self-defense, and Hadrian Updike dignified to the point of parody. Each took the seat Wolfe indicated, with the suspicion of people who think they might be tricked out of their reputations. Wolfe folded his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you are here because the events at Rusterman's involved a public insult. To the trust, to its director, and indirectly to me. I intend to rectify that by demonstration. Archie?" I uncorked the bottle of claret Henry had preserved and poured it carefully into the jug. Wolfe inclined his head to me, the conductor's signal. "Now observe." I tilted the jug over a glass. The wine flowed smooth and steady, ruby and obedient. Not a trace of the mischief that had humiliated them all 2 nights earlier. Wolfe's eyes flicked from face to face, registering every flinch, every blink. "Perfect function," he said, "which confirms what I suspected, that the vessel itself is innocent. Yet at the appointed hour, it failed to perform. Temporarily, that suggests a deliberate obstruction, transient, precise, and reversible." Updike cleared his throat. "A trivial prank, then?" "No," Wolfe said sharply. "An act of contempt, the work of someone who understands both chemistry and theater." His gaze paused on Ames, long enough to stir discomfort, then shifted toward Lang. "Someone who wished to see Miss Vale diminished, Rusterman's embarrassed, and the trust destabilized. The timing was exquisite, the insult public, the damage symbolic. It was a strike at competence, not at property." Marjorie Kent exhaled loudly. "Surely you're not implying one of us—" "Puis," Wolfe interrupted. "I imply nothing. I demonstrate." He turned the jug upright and beckoned Fritz, who stepped forward with a small candle stub. Wolfe's fingers moved delicately, holding the jug's handle near the flame for several seconds. A craftsman would know that slight heat expands trapped air. A chemist or a prankster might exploit that. He motioned to me. "Now, Archie." I tipped the jug again. Nothing. The wine sat stubborn, unmoving as if welded. Gasps rippled through the room. "Remarkable," Wolfe murmured. "A simple application of wax, microscopic, placed in the air channel here." He pointed with a pencil. "Would seal it under cool conditions. The warmth of the candle softens it again, resealing. As it cools, the passage reopens. Ingenious, if petty." Ames shifted in his seat, color draining. That's absurd. I explained this precise mechanism to Mr. Goodwin yesterday. Wolfe finished for him. Before it was tested, you described it as a common trick. Indeed, so common you anticipated my reconstruction. Admirable foresight, Doctor. The silence could have been bottled. Lang looked intrigued, Kent offended, Vale rigid. Ames stammered. I only theorized. I didn't do it. Wolfe's tone didn't rise, but it tightened. Your knowledge and your presence coincide too neatly to be coincidence. The wax compound you likely used dissolves in alcohol, wine, for instance, leaving no trace but the memory of humiliation. You intended to demonstrate Miss Vale's ignorance, perhaps to elevate your own standing as a man of science. Yet your vanity betrayed you. Ames rose, trembling with dignity that didn't fit him. This is preposterous. You have no proof. I have enough, Wolfe said. Only a chemist would have known both method and means, and only a fool would have lectured on it afterward. Ames's lips thinned. He looked at Vale, anger, shame, and something like apology flickering all at once. Then he turned and left without a word. No one moved. Wolfe sat back, serene as a judge whose verdict had already been written. The trust may now proceed without its saboteur. Miss Vale, you may inform your board discreetly or loudly, as you choose. I recommend the former. Dr. Ames will not contest exposure. He will retreat to his laboratory and contrition. Vale drew a slow breath. You're certain? I do not accuse, Wolfe said. I conclude. When they'd gone, I lingered by the door. You had that pegged yesterday, I said. Wolfe's eyes closed. Archie, never mistake certainty for speed. Truth ripens. Ames wanted to prove superiority over the vulgarity of spectacle. He succeeded, briefly. Now he will learn the disadvantage of intellect without proportion. He poured himself a glass of the reclaimed claret, swirling it once before tasting. Acceptable, he murmured, though I detest wine served with irony. Then maybe we'll stick to beer, I said. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Beer never pretends to pour better than men. Dinner that night was roast duck with orange glaze, a dish that could make a man forget the world, but Wolfe forgot nothing. He ate in silence, which meant I might as well have been dining with a statue that occasionally reached for wine. Fritz tried twice to introduce conversation, once about the sauce's acidity, once about a shipment of truffles, but Wolfe's satisfactory ended both attempts like a trap door closing. When coffee arrived, he finally leaned back, eyes half shut, and said, Archie, when a man's motive is humiliation, his method always reveals something about himself. Meaning Ames? I asked. Meaning Ames, yes, but not only him. He set his cup down. His interference was clever, but too delicate to originate in frustration alone. I underestimated one factor. He did not act alone. I looked up from my cup. You think someone helped him? No, he said. Someone guided him. He's a man of process, not inspiration. His resentment of Miss Vale's authority was genuine, but his performance, timed, polished, and public, required orchestration. He paused, eyes opening to the orchid shelves. I dislike orchestras I didn't conduct. That line might have been for my benefit, but it carried weight. I said, all right. If Ames wasn't the composer, who was? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a slip of paper, notes from that morning's interviews, written in his slow, deliberate hand. Marjorie Kent, vain but politically astute. Pietro Lang, ambitious and opportunistic. Updike, proud, proprietary, and calculating. Miss Vale, too proud perhaps to recognize manipulation. You're saying one of them pushed Ames into it. I'm saying he was used. Wolfe folded his hands, fingertips touching. Ames could construct the mechanism, but he would not choose the moment. The theater of the act, the presence of press, critics, donors, suggests a strategist. Updike, I said. He had motive, ego, and he's been collecting enemies since the Hoover administration. Wolfe's brow twitched. He also has restraint. He delights in disdain, not scandal. However, he gestured slightly toward the desk. He knew precisely what form of failure would wound the trust's credibility without implicating himself. The wax, the timing, the ridicule. It was his intellect, not Ames's temper. I whistled softly. So Ames built the trap, and Updike pulled the string. Precisely. A collaboration of intellect and arrogance. Wolfe rang for Fritz, who appeared instantly. "Fritz, tomorrow evening we shall host a small gathering. Miss Vale, Mr. Updike, and, regrettably, Mr. Ames, if he can be persuaded. Archie will arrange it." Fritz inclined his head and disappeared without a word, the way only Fritz can when murder isn't on the menu but humiliation is. I said, "You plan to make them confess over canapes?" "I plan," Wolfe said, "to make them reveal the truth as naturally as breathing. Mr. Updike will be incapable of resisting an opportunity to defend his honor, and Mr. Ames, if confronted subtly, will seek to share his guilt." The next evening, the brownstone was as tense as a chessboard before the final move. The guests arrived under varying degrees of discomfort. Vale looked wary but determined. Ames, pale and defensive. Updike, immaculate and impatient. Wolfe received them with minimal civility. "I've invited you," he began, "because a misunderstanding remains unresolved. Dr. Ames has been accused of sabotage. Before the trust is further sullied, I propose we clarify whether his act was solitary." Updike gave a dry laugh. "Surely this isn't necessary. The matter was unfortunate, yes, but Miss Vale has been exonerated. Must we drag this out?" "I must," Wolfe said, "because I dislike incomplete equations. Dr. Ames, you were not alone in your design. Someone urged you toward your demonstration, promising vindication, perhaps influence. Speak." Ames' hands trembled slightly on his knees. No one urged me. I acted alone. It was a lapse." Wolfe's voice softened, dangerously. "Nonsense. You are incapable of theatrical timing. You needed assurance that your act would have witnesses of consequence, that its significance would be understood. Who suggested the moment?" Ames's eyes darted to Updike, then back. That was enough. Updike's expression hardened, but he kept his composure. "This is outrageous. I had no part in this man's idiocy." "Indeed." Wolfe's tone was silk over steel. "You described to Mr. Goodwin the jug's air channel and its sensitivity to blockage. You boasted of its craftsmanship, yet failed to mention that you demonstrated the same principle at a tasting 1 week before the event. Dr. Ames attended that tasting." Updike blinked, the faintest crack in his armor. "Pure coincidence?" "Hardly. You mocked the trust's modernity, called Miss Vale's approach vulgar, and demonstrated how easily tradition could refuse to pour for the unworthy." "Your words, Mr. Updike." Silence. Vale stared at him, disbelief turning into fury. Ames opened his mouth, closed it again, then muttered, "He said it would prove her reckless." That she'd overreached. "Enough," Updike snapped, rising. "I meant no harm." "But harm was done," Wolfe said, his voice low and absolute. "You engineered humiliation by proxy. You infected another's vanity with your own. That is a corruption of intellect." Updike looked for an exit that wasn't there. "You can't prove—" "I need not. You've confessed to motive, and your tool has confessed to method. I require nothing further." Vale stood, her composure cracking only at the edges. "Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly, "you've restored more than my reputation. You've restored Rustermann's." Wolfe inclined his head. "And my digestion," he murmured. "Fritz, beer." As they left, Updike silent and pale, Ames mumbling apologies, Wolfe reached for his glass. "Archie," he said, "there are two kinds of intellect, those that illuminate and those that burn. Mr. Updike's will flicker out soon enough. And Vale? I asked. She'll learn, he said. Pain is a patient tutor. He lifted his beer, took one slow sip, and closed his eyes. Now, Archie, remind me, was there dessert? Cherry strudel, I said. Injustice, apparently. He almost smiled. Then bring both. The next morning began with sunlight glinting off the jug, as if it had decided to forgive humanity for its recent indignities. Wolfe was in the plant rooms by then, tending to orchids as if nothing of consequence had occurred the night before. I was in the office, fielding a phone call from Portia Vale. Her voice had the kind of restraint that leaks. I wanted to thank Mr. Wolfe, she said, discreetly. The board met this morning. Ames has resigned, and Updike is reconsidering his associations. We'll issue a statement about a technical irregularity. It will die quietly. Good. The quiet deaths are my boss's favorite kind. There was a pause. Tell him that if ever the trust can repay his favor. Don't offer him favors, I said. Offer him lunch. She laughed, the first genuine sound I'd heard from her. Then lunch it is. When I relayed that to Wolfe later, he muttered, lunch is acceptable. Favors are vulgar. Then he went back to dictating an order to the orchid nursery, and I figured the case was officially closed. But at 3 that afternoon, a knock at the door reintroduced complication. Fritz opened it, and in walked Saul Panzer, looking like a man who had brought an extra page to the story. He nodded to me, then to Wolfe, who had just returned from his sanctum and was lowering himself into the chair with his usual ceremony. Good afternoon, Mr. Wolfe. Sorry to intrude. Thought you'd want to see this. He handed over a manila envelope. I was tailing Dr. Ames yesterday evening after the, gathering. You didn't tell me to, but I figured the air smelled unfinished. That earned him one of Wolfe's rare approving glances. Proceed. Saul settled into a chair. He went home, stayed an hour, then drove out to Westchester, stopped at an estate belonging to, wait for it, Mr. Updike. They talked for 40 minutes in the garden. When Ames left, he looked like he'd swallowed sandpaper. Updike looked worse. Wolfe's brows climbed. Ah. An hour later, Saul went on, Updike made a phone call from his study. I pulled a favor at the exchange. He called a lawyer, the same firm that handles his estate. So I dug a little more. This morning, the firm filed a revised will. I whistled. That's fast work for a man who just got caught playing puppet master. Saul's eyes were dry as dust. It gets better. He also transferred a certain 18th century picture to the trust's custody, officially and permanently. Gifted property. Wolfe's gaze moved to the jug, and I could swear it gleamed smugly under the lamplight. Conscience, he murmured. Or calculation. Could be either, I said. Maybe both. Maybe he thinks generosity will outlive scandal. Scandal never dies, Wolfe said. It merely hibernates. He opened the envelope Saul had brought, revealing photographs, grainy but clear enough. Ames handing over a small package to Updike. What's that? I asked. Saul leaned forward. That's the interesting part. I got close enough to hear a word or two. Ames said, this will dissolve clean. Wax, I guessed. Or something like it, Saul said. If you'd like, I can pay another visit to Updike's chemist. Wolfe shook his head slowly. No, let it rest. Mr. Updike has already dissolved himself in his own way. He looked down at the photograph, eyes narrowing to slits. What interests me now is why Ames still felt the need to see him. Guilt seeks confession, but Ames is a man of intellect, not soul. He wanted to ensure silence. Insurance, I said. Precisely. A final transaction. Updike trades ownership for discretion, a fitting epilogue for men who thought truth negotiable. Saul nodded. Then we're done here. Wolfe inclined his head. We are, Saul. Thank you. When he left, the silence in the room had a different flavor. Less satisfaction, more reflection. Wolfe poured himself a beer and stared at the jug again. "Archie," he said finally, "you will deliver this object to the trust tomorrow. Securely, without ceremony. Tell Miss Vale that Rusterman's reputation is restored and that she owes me nothing further." "Nothing except lunch?" "Lunch is transactional. Gratitude is corrosive." He took a slow sip. "I prefer neither." I leaned against the desk. "You realize, of course, that you've just salvaged the pride of 3 institutions in 1 week. Rusterman's, the Trust, and your own." "Pfui," he said. "I detest institutions. They leak humanity." "And people?" I asked. "They leak worse." I let that hang. Fritz came in to clear the tray, pausing to glance at the picture. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Yes," Wolfe replied, "and faithless, like most beauty." When the door closed, Wolfe sighed, deep and slow. "Archie, the matter concludes here. The pitcher poured when commanded, refused when defied, and taught us nothing we didn't already know. That intelligence, misapplied, is the cruelest servant." "Sure," I said, "but it made for a fine show." He looked up, the faintest spark of humor in his eyes. "Then humanity got its money's worth. Now kindly bring me the Gazette. I require distraction before dinner." As I fetched the paper, the jug caught a slant of late sunlight, its silver skin alive with reflections. For a moment, I thought I saw my own grin staring back. Crooked, skeptical, and a little too knowing. Then it faded, and the brownstone returned to its usual calm, the case folded neatly into Wolfe's files and my memory, where both would stay polished long after the last drop of wine was gone. The following day, I delivered the jug as ordered, wrapped, cushioned, and accompanied by my best imitation of solemn respect. Portia Vale met me in her office at the Trust, a corner suite with too much glass and not enough warmth. She looked lighter than before, though the fatigue under her polish still lingered. She inspected the package briefly before nodding to an assistant to take it away. "I suppose it's over," she said, though that phrase never seems true until the papers stop calling. "They'll stop," I said. "They already found a congressman who can't balance a checkbook, so you've been demoted to a paragraph." "That's fine by me," she said, almost smiling. "Mr. Wolfe told me to keep things quiet. I intend to, but there's something that's been bothering me." I didn't say, "Of course there is." I just waited. After you and Mr. Wolfe exposed Dr. Ames, I checked the Trust's accounts. We'd authorized no payment to him beyond his stipend, but 2 weeks ago a consulting fee appeared. Signed by Hadrian Updike, it was labeled Historical Verification. I leaned back. A convenient title for hush money. Exactly. It was transferred before the event, not after. Ames didn't just fall into Updike's trap. He walked in on salary. I whistled low. And that makes Updike's donation of the jug less charity, more camouflage. She nodded. Which means your Mr. Wolfe was right. They were partners, but Updike had started covering his tracks before the sabotage even happened. I made a note to tell Wolfe that his deduction had grown another layer. "Keep a copy of that record," I said. "Wolfe might want to see it." "I already sent one to your office," she said. "I have a feeling he doesn't like loose ends." She was right about that. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with the envelope open in front of him, the paper already smoothed to submission. "Miss Vale is an efficient woman," he said. "She's also right," I replied. Updike was paying Ames weeks before the performance. He didn't improvise the humiliation. He financed it. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his voice carried weight. Then he anticipated failure, not as a possibility, but as a product. He purchased his outrage in advance. "And made sure he could afford the apology later," I said. "That's the kind of foresight that ruins men gently." He leaned back, eyes closing. Archie, there are degrees of malice. The most refined kind believes itself moral. Mr. Updike intended a lesson in propriety, delivered through humiliation. When his creation disobeyed him, when public reaction exceeded expectation, he sought absolution through philanthropy. Classic vanity, dressed as remorse. Which means, I said, he's probably sleeping fine right now. Wolfe snorted softly. Undoubtedly. His sort always do. The phone rang then. Fritz answered, passed it to me. It was Inspector Kramer, which is never good for the digestion. "Goodwin," he barked. "Tell your boss that his friends at Rusterman's just made the morning blotter. Updike was found dead in his townhouse. Gas leak, they think. You tell Wolfe before I decide to send him a bouquet." He hung up before I could respond. I turned. "Wolfe." "I heard," he said, eyes opening, voice quiet. "Kramer?" "Yeah, Updike's dead. Gas leak, supposedly." He didn't move. The silence stretched. Finally, he murmured, "A man who engineers humiliation rarely endures it himself. Suicide, most likely, though wrapped in the convenience of accident." "You sound certain?" "I am." He rose slightly in his chair, not enough to call it standing, and looked toward the jug's empty space on the desk. He realized that guilt, once staged, cannot be cancelled by generosity. It consumes its creator. I sat, letting that sink in. "So that's it then." Curtain down. "On Updike, yes. But not on the human farce. Miss Vale will thrive now. Too much competence to fail. Ames will spend his life explaining his mistake to people who've already forgotten it. And we," he added with faint disdain, "are left with an empty desk and the odor of moral resolution. I detest moral resolution." "Don't worry," I said. "The world will mess it up again by dinner." That got me a glare so mild it almost counted as a smile. "Indeed," he said. "In the meantime, Fritz has prepared pheasant. If you wish to feel useful, fetch the Gazette and open a bottle of that Tokay. I'll tolerate wine tonight." "Celebrating?" "Hardly," Wolfe said. "Reflecting." The rest of the day slid quietly into evening. The city outside sounded restless, but inside the brownstone the air was calm, sealed off from the absurdities that kept us employed. Wolfe ate, Fritz hummed, and I sat by the window, half listening to the world spin itself into fresh trouble. When I finally looked back at Wolfe, he was staring into his glass, his voice barely above a murmur. "Archie, remember this. Intellect, when deprived of humility, will always pour its contents upon itself. The rest is just gravity." I nodded. "You've still got away with philosophy." He set down the glass. "Phooey. Philosophy is only logic in evening clothes. Pass the salt." And that was that. The case of the pitcher that never poured was over. Its lessons poured, its culprits dissolved, and the brownstone restored to its tranquil tyranny. By midnight, the orchids glowed in the greenhouse, the city sulked beyond the windows, and Nero Wolfe, immovable as ever, had turned the last act of humiliation into a quiet sermon on the vanity of intellect, which, coming from him, was practically humility itself. The next morning came with fog thick enough to muffle the street noise and slow the city's pulse to a crawl. Inside the brownstone, however, there was no fog thick enough to mute the clatter of Wolfe's routine. At 11 sharp, he was in the office, dictionary open beside his coffee, orchid ledger balanced on the arm of his chair. If Serenity had an address, it would have been ours, until the phone rang again. I got it on the first ring, expecting a delivery or Fritz's butcher. Instead, Inspector Kramer's voice rasped through the line like sandpaper on steel. "Goodwin, tell your boss I'm outside, and tell him I'm not here for the orchids." When I relayed that, Wolfe didn't sigh. He inhaled deeply, which was worse. "Show him in," he said, as if he were inviting pneumonia. Kramer entered like a man who brought his own weather. His coat was damp, his cigar unlit but determined. He looked at Wolfe, then at me, then at the empty space on the desk where the jug had once sat. "So," he said, "the philanthropist is dead, conveniently after your little tea party." Wolfe gestured toward the red chair. "Sit, Inspector. You're dripping on my carpet." Kramer ignored the offer. "Don't play housekeeper with me, Wolfe. I want to know how much you knew and when." "I knew that Mr. Updike was guilty of arrogance," Wolfe said mildly, "and that such guilt is sometimes terminal." Kramer's jaw worked. "He didn't gas himself by accident. We've got residue from a chemical compound around the valve. Looks like it was tampered with. And before you smirk, no, it wasn't sabotage from the outside. Someone Updike trusted was in that house." That got Wolfe's full attention. "How certain?" "Certain enough that I had to skip lunch." "Tragic," I said. Kramer threw me a look sharp enough to peel paint. "Your client list overlaps this mess, Goodwin. Vale, Ames, Updike, all tied together. Now one's dead, and I don't believe in poetic coincidence. If Wolfe knew this was coming and didn't tell me—" "Phooey," Wolfe said, a syllable as flat as a verdict. "I'm not clairvoyant, Inspector. I solve crimes. I don't predict them." Kramer grunted. "Then start solving. Because if I find out Miss Vale or that chemist pal of hers had a hand in this, I'll be back with a warrant." He left the same way he came, trailing smoke and suspicion. The air afterward felt stretched thin. Wolfe remained still for a full minute, eyes half-lidded. Finally, he said, "Archie, call Miss Vale. Tell her to come here immediately." "She'll think she's being arrested." "She should," he said. "Fear loosens the tongue." By the time she arrived, the fog had lifted, but the tension hadn't. She looked more polished than yesterday, but carried herself like a woman walking on fractured glass. "Inspector Kramer came to see you," she asked before she even sat down. "He did," Wolfe said. "He believes Mr. Updike was murdered. Do you share his belief?" Her eyes widened. "Murdered? No, he must have—" She stopped herself. "He was distraught, but not suicidal. He'd called me that morning to apologize. He said he was leaving the trust entirely. He wanted peace." "Peace," Wolfe said, "is often fatal to restless men." "Tell me, did Dr. Ames contact you after our gathering?" "Yes. Last night. He said he wanted to speak privately to explain himself. I told him not to. I thought it was done." Wolfe's lids lowered. "You refused him." "I had to. My board would have revolted if I met him." "Then he may have sought absolution elsewhere." I said, "You think Ames killed Updike?" "I think," Wolfe said. Ames discovered that Updike had turned his contrition into property transfer, a final insult. Ames built his humiliation with his own hands, only to see his collaborator canonized as a benefactor. For a mind like his, that is unbearable. Vale's face went pale. "You mean revenge?" "No," Wolfe said softly. "Balance. The chemist's form of justice. Precise, bloodless, and final." She stared at him. "If you believe that, you have to tell the police." "I have to do nothing," Wolfe said. "Kramer's evidence will find its way regardless. My obligation is to truth, not to the law's appetite for drama." When she left, the room felt smaller, heavier. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. "Archie," he said, "call Saul. Have him trace Dr. Ames. Quietly. If he fled, we'll know he's guilty. If he hasn't, he's thinking, and thinking men are always dangerous." That evening, Saul called back. "Found him," he said. "Ames checked into a hotel near the East River under his own name, alone. Ordered no dinner, asked for a newspaper, and requested a wake-up call that he never plans to use, if you ask me." I told Wolfe. He nodded once. "Go," he said. "Bring him here. Do not argue, do not threaten, merely invite. Tell him Nero Wolfe wishes to understand him. That, I suspect, will be irresistible." When I found Ames, he looked exactly like a man wrestling with equations that had stopped balancing. His face was hollowed out, eyes glassy but alert. When I told him Wolfe wanted to see him, he hesitated only a moment before nodding. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe waited with a single lamp burning, the room shadowed but sharp. "Dr. Ames," he said as the man entered. "You have come, then. Excellent. You may sit. We shall discuss the chemistry of remorse." And from the way Ames lowered himself into the chair, I knew we'd crossed into the last act. Ames sat with his hands clasped tight, the knuckles pale against the dim light. For a man who'd already confessed to humiliation, he wore composure like armor, cracked but not yet surrendered. Wolfe studied him in silence long enough to make a clock self-conscious. "I didn't kill him," Ames said finally, voice low but steady. "If that's what this is." "Of course it is," Wolfe replied. "You engineered a spectacle that degraded you. Your collaborator turned it into his absolution. Then he died conveniently. You're the remaining intellect in a room full of motives. You'll forgive my curiosity." Ames exhaled, looking at the carpet. "He called me that morning. Wanted to meet. He said he'd made things right." I didn't know what he meant until I arrived. He showed me the legal papers, the gift transfer, his apology letter. He said the trust would survive, and my name would fade quietly. He thought that was mercy. "And you found that intolerable," Wolfe said. Ames shook his head. "I found it absurd. He never saw what he'd done. To him I was a tool, a man of mechanism. When I told him I'd been ruined while he got to play the martyr, he said I'd contributed to the lesson. That word, lesson. He thought everything was a moral anecdote." I asked, "So you gave him one he couldn't recite?" Ames looked at me sharply. "No, I left. Furious, yes, but I left. When I walked out, he was still talking, still rationalizing. I went home. I drank. I almost went back, but I didn't. Whatever happened after that wasn't my doing." Wolfe's eyes didn't move. "Almost went back, but you didn't. I swear it." The pause that followed could have filled a paragraph. Wolfe gestured to me. "Archie, the police found residue of a chemical at the gas valve, consistent with adhesive sealant and industrial resin." "Yes," I said. "Kramer mentioned it." Wolfe's gaze returned to Ames. "You are a chemist. You know its volatility." "I do," Ames admitted. "But anyone could acquire it. Not anyone would use it precisely enough to time suffocation before dawn," Wolfe said. "No, this act required control, and a man capable of turning physics into poetry. The very sort of man who would design a trick that lets wine refuse to pour, only to clear itself when applause fades." Ames's breath caught. "You think I recreated my failure?" "I think you perfected it," Wolfe said softly. "The same formula inverted. This time not to humiliate, but to silence." "That's insane." Ames's hands shook just slightly. "You can't prove that." "No," Wolfe said, "but you can." Ames's jaw tightened. "I'm not your experiment." "Everything is an experiment to the scientific temperament," Wolfe said, "including guilt." He leaned forward, voice suddenly quiet enough to make the room lean with him. "You killed him, Doctor. Not in passion, but precision. You measured his vanity and your hatred, combined them and applied pressure until combustion. He died as he lived. An example." Ames stared at him, breathing hard. Then, to my surprise, he laughed, hoarse, bitter, genuine. "You always win, don't you?" "I do not win," Wolfe said. "I end." Ames stood abruptly. "Then end this." He turned toward the door but stopped halfway. His shoulders dropped. "You think you understand. You don't. It wasn't hatred. It was necessity. He would have rewritten everything, again. The trust, the narrative, history itself. You can't let a man like that live unpunished. You just can't." He looked back at Wolfe, eyes hollow but alive. "Tell Kramer I saved him the trouble of another confession." And before I could move, he reached into his coat. "Archie." Wolfe's bark hit the air, but I was already there, lunging. I caught his arm as the small vial slipped free. Clear glass, amber liquid inside. It shattered against the rug. The smell was sharp, chemical, and unmistakable. "Poison," Wolfe said flatly. Ames didn't resist as I twisted his wrist behind his back. He just stared at the rug, breathing raggedly. "He didn't deserve to decide what story survived," he whispered. "Neither of you do." Within 10 minutes, Kramer was pounding at the door again, called by a word from Wolfe that must have carried like thunder. They took Ames quietly. No struggle. Just a faint nod when I handed him over. When the door closed and the house went still again, Wolfe sat back, eyes closed, hands folded. "Archie," he said finally, "the intellect of man is a noble engine, but left ungoverned, it becomes a guillotine." I nodded, still hearing Ames's laugh in my ears. "Well, this one just sharpened itself." He gave a tired grunt. "Indeed." Yet he sought control, even in surrender. He looked toward the broken glass glinting on the rug. "Clean that. Fritz must not smell despair when he brings my lunch." I did as told. When I came back, Wolfe was staring out the window, city fog rising again beyond the glass. "Justice," he murmured, "is never neat. It pours only when it wishes." I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. Outside, the world carried on, restless, stupid, alive. Inside, the brownstone returned to silence, and the last echo of that impossible picture faded into memory. In the end, Wolfe was right. The picture that never poured had been less a trick than a warning, and like everything that passed through his hands, it had poured its meaning at last, slow, deliberate, and final. The day after Ames was taken, the brownstone settled back into its natural rhythm, silence punctuated by the noises of civilization, typewriter keys, the clink of cutlery, and Wolfe's voice summoning Fritz with the imperial calm of a man who expected the world to obey the laws of lunch. The jug, or what was left of its memory, no longer occupied the desk. It had been returned, case closed. Or so I thought. Wolfe was in his chair reading when the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a client or a cop. It was Portia Vale. She looked composed but subdued, like someone who'd finished a long climb and found the view less inspiring than promised. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I came to thank you, though I'm not sure gratitude is what this calls for." "Then do not force it," Wolfe said. "It makes an unpleasant sound." She smiled faintly. "The trust will survive. The papers are already calling Updike's death an accident and Dr. Ames's arrest a tragedy of conscience. No one seems to grasp what really happened. Humanity prefers its truth simplified," Wolfe said. "Complexity unsettles digestion." She took a seat without being asked, rare courage in this room, and looked at me. "You saw them both. Do you think either man ever understood what they were doing?" I said. "One wanted to humiliate. The other wanted to matter. They met halfway and fell in." She nodded, thoughtful. "I suppose that's the real crime, isn't it? Pride in disguise." "Pride needs no disguise," Wolfe said. "It thrives naked." But yes, their motives were kin. They sought mastery, not meaning. She studied him for a moment. "And you, Mr. Wolfe? What do you seek?" He lifted his gaze from the page, heavy and direct. "Equilibrium. It is the rarest luxury." That seemed to end it for her. She rose, smoothing her gloves. "You've restored more than a reputation," she said softly. "You've reminded us that control isn't wisdom." He inclined his head slightly. "If you must quote me, do it accurately." When she left, the air in the room seemed to relax, as though even the walls had been holding their breath. I watched Wolfe for a while, wondering if the lecture on equilibrium was meant for her or for himself. "You know," I said, "you handled this one with less gloating than usual." He grunted. There was nothing to gloat about. The intellect of both men failed in the same fashion. one from indulgence, the other from imitation. Neither is worth savoring. That may be, I said, but it makes a hell of a story. Sabotage, betrayal, revenge, suicide. Pretty good material for the next dinner conversation. Bah, Wolfe said. Dinner conversation should be about sources. He closed his book, signaling the world's return to order. Archie, the moral, if you insist on having one, is simple. Intellect without conscience is like a jug without air. It cannot pour. Fine, I said, but next time, let's pick a case where nobody dies of metaphor. He almost smiled. You overvalue comfort. Go tell Fritz I'll have the beer cold and the cheese ripe. Civilization, Archie, begins at the table. So I went to the kitchen, and the world continued turning. The orchids upstairs glowed against the afternoon light. The city outside kept inventing its own disasters. By the time we sat down to dinner, the fog had lifted for good. Wolfe took his first sip of beer, sighed contentedly, and declared that the balance of the universe, for the moment, was restored. And maybe it was. The pitcher that never poured had finally done its work. Not in wine, but in revelation. And as always, Wolfe had drunk deeply from it without ever leaving his chair, 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 leaving his chair.